A masked guest arrived at Harrow Court, yet no one knew his face. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallow. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Every reply makes these stories richer. I always look forward. The storm had gathered over Harrow Court since early afternoon, though it seemed almost too theatrical for the dignified old house. Set on a rise above the Hampshire countryside, with its long avenue of beeches and its polished oak staircases, Harrow Court was the sort of place that did not encourage melodrama. The guests had arrived in a spirit of amusement, prepared for the evening's entertainment, a masked ball in honour of Lady Charlotte Harrow's 50th birthday. Yet there was something faintly uneasy in the air, even before the first strains of music began. Perhaps it was the weather, those low, bruised clouds that pressed against the windows, or perhaps it was the peculiar nature of the invitations. Each guest had been assigned a mask and persona in advance, and the instructions were explicit. They were not to reveal their true identity until the unmasking at midnight. Lady Charlotte, a tall, imperious woman with a fondness for dramatic flourishes, had described it as a little game of concealment to keep conversation fresh. It was after 10 when the first whispers began. A guest in a silver half-mask, tall, with a voice that carried, had been seen speaking to Lady Charlotte in the library. Minutes later, Lady Charlotte was called away by a servant. When she returned, her expression had altered. Gone was the indulgent smile. In its place was something sharper, almost guarded. The guests danced. Champagne was poured. Outside, the rain fell in relentless silver lines. But at 11:30, when the clock in the hall struck the 3/4 hour, a footman approached Sir Giles Harrow, Lady Charlotte's husband, with a pale face and a stammering urgency. Sir Giles excused himself. The music faltered. Then, the commotion. Lady Charlotte was found in the small morning room off the west corridor, seated at her escritoire as though composing a letter. The pen had fallen from her hand. Her head was tilted to one side, and the grotesque beauty of the golden mask she wore seemed to mock the stillness beneath it. The doctor, fetched in haste from among the guests, pronounced her dead before midnight struck. There was no obvious cause, no wound, no sign of violence. Yet the position of her chair, the curious angle of the window latch, and the faintest scent of bitter almonds in the air left no doubt that this was no sudden illness. The silver-masked guest was nowhere to be found, and when, at last, the masks came off in the great hall, there was one unclaimed, a silver half-mask laid neatly on the side table, as though its wearer had never existed at all. By the time dawn broke over Harrow Court, the storm had passed, leaving the lawns glistening and the gravel drive washed clean. But inside, the house still held the heavy, unspoken knowledge. Someone among the elegant, self-possessed guests had killed Lady Charlotte Harrow, and the one person who might have been a stranger was now a phantom no one could name. It was mid-morning when the telephone in the morning room rang again. Sir Giles, pale but controlled, lifted the receiver, listened, and after a brief pause said in a voice that carried into the hallway, "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. We need you at Harrow Court at once." By noon the rain had resigned itself to a sullen drizzle, and the drive to Harrow Court glistened like a ribbon of slate. The house, which had seemed so theatrical under last night's storm, was this morning merely austere. The beeches along the avenue stood as if they had been summoned to witness something official. Hercule Poirot stepped from the hired motor with the care of a man alighting onto a stage he had not arranged. A footman hurried forward with an umbrella. Poirot declined it with a small shake of the head, straightened his cuffs, and looked, not at the grand façade, but at the gravel close to the steps. There, the rain, in its democratic way, had smoothed most disturbances, yet he bent, lifting between finger and thumb a flattened paper rose petal crushed to pale mush. So, he murmured to himself, a masquerade indeed. Sir Giles Harrow met him in the hall. He had the composed courtesy of a man who has sat on several boards and been bored by most of them. The face was handsome and tired. The eyes had slept but not rested. Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming so swiftly. You will forgive that I come always with conditions, Poirot replied, handing his hat to the butler. Les conditions are very simple. That no one who attended the ball last night departs, that the room in which Lady Charlotte was found remains as it was, and that I am given the freedom to be impertinent where the truth is concerned. Sir Giles inclined his head. Inspector Winter has already agreed to keep the guests here until matters are resolved. He is practical. The faintest shade of disdain clouded the last word, and Poirot's moustaches twitched in private amusement. The morning room lay off a panelled corridor on the west side. The door was guarded by a constable. Inside, the air still held a ghost of last night's perfume, a sweetness made sharp by that elusive, bitter trace. Poirot paused upon the threshold, taking in the arrangement in an instant, and then, as was his habit, taking it in again as if for the first time. The escritoire, open, the chair, angled not quite toward the window but slightly counter to it, as if the occupant had half turned to speak to someone at the door. The window latch, yes, at an odd diagonal, as though it had been pushed down without the pressure settling cleanly into place. On the side table, a little glass vase with 3 stems of white stock, one snapped as if a hand had brushed it clumsily. A gold fleck. No, not gold. Gilt. On the inner lip of the latch. A dust like fairy crumbs. He did not touch. He only leaned closer, breathing very little. Inspector Winter stood aside, hands behind his back, an expression of dogged openness on his face. Dr. Pritchard was among the guests. He pronounced death quite quickly, said there was no point removing the mask at once, that it was better to wait. We did, and when we did remove it later, there was nothing to show. No mark. The scent. He let it trail. Poirot nodded. It is like an opera in which one has heard already the overture. One waits only to see which singer will fail a note. He moved to the desk. The pen had indeed fallen. The blotter bore in the reversed hieroglyphics of the recently written strokes and loops. He bent low, then drew from his pocket a little lens and looked, not at the writing, but at where blotter met leather, at a torn corner, no bigger than a stamp, the fibres ragged and recent. He replaced the lens and straightened at once, as if bored by his own interest. Monsieur l'Inspecteur, if you would be so kind as to have everyone assemble in the long drawing-room. I like, you see, to look at my chessboard entire before I move a piece. They came in 2s and 3s, reluctant to collect themselves into a single picture. A masquerade has a way of loosening those invisible threads of civility. People who had played at secret identities now shrank from their real ones. Poirot took a chair, not at the head, but slightly apart, so that he might see faces in profile as well as full on. Sir Giles stood by the mantel with the posture of a man hosting his own misfortune. "This is Monsieur Hercule Poirot," Inspector Winter announced. "He has been engaged by Sir Giles to assist. You will answer his questions as you would mine." Poirot rose a fraction, bowed, and sat again. "We will begin with what is simple. You will tell me your names, your relations to Lady Charlotte, and where you were at 11:30 when she was discovered." He smiled. "We will leave for later the little things that seem to you nothings." The first to speak was a woman whose efficiency preceded her like a draught. Crisp, pale blouse under a tailored jacket, a notebook that had clearly slept beside her for years. Beatrice Lascelles, Lady Charlotte's social secretary and companion. I have lived at Harrow Court for 5 years. "And last night, Mademoiselle Lascelles?" Poirot prompted. "From 11 to 11:30, I was in the ballroom, assisting with the order of the unmasking and the cake. At 11:30, I went toward the west corridor in search of Lady Charlotte. She had left the library. I met Foster, the footman, running toward Sir Giles. He had already found her." Inspector Winter nodded. "The footman's account agrees. Poirot observed the little tremor that passed across Miss Lascelles' fingers, and went no further than her pen. She is a fortress, he thought, but even fortresses have doors. A man of 50 with a pleasant, cultivated face stepped forward next, his hair already tending to grey in the attractive way that suggests learning. Dr. Lionel Pritchard. I have attended Lady Charlotte in a professional capacity for some years, though I was here as a guest. I was in the ballroom at 11:30. I was fetched by Sir Giles moments later. You recognized at once that she was dead, Poirot said mildly. Yes. You did not think it, how to say, prudent to remove the mask? Dr. Pritchard's mouth compressed. I did not wish to disturb possible evidence, and Sir Giles was adamant we should do nothing until the police arrived. Poirot inclined his head, as one gentleman acknowledging another's restraint, while thinking that men are never so careful as when they have already judged the outcome. A tall man, with an artist's shambling elegance, lounged near the window, hands in pockets, eyes bright with the kind of mischief that had gone too long unpunished. Jasper Vale, he said, when the silence became accusatory. Portrait painter. Lady Charlotte had me sketch her last month with a view to a grand canvas for the autumn. We were to discuss it last night. And did you? Poirot's voice was unruffled. We exchanged words, yes. A little grin. She did not like my suggestion that we abandon the allegorical drapery and paint her as she actually is. Was, Mr. Vale, Miss Lascelles snapped, and then looked at the floor, annoyed with herself. And at the time of 11:30? In the library with a very indifferent brandy, admiring the Harrow ancestors. The footman can confirm he brought me the glass there. Poirot allowed himself a small cough behind his hand to cover the neat little stone that Mr. Vale had thrown into the pond of the room. He is a man who enjoys the ripple, he noted. A woman in black, whose mourning had been chosen for effect as much as sentiment, sat very straight, gloved hands pressed together. Frederica Lyon, she said, the voice faintly theatrical. An old friend of Charlotte's. We were at school together. I had not seen her for years until last spring. I was in the orangery at the time, I believe, with Mr. Vale earlier, and then alone. The storm was, well, picturesque. Madame Lyon, Poirot returned. With whom did you dance before that? She blinked. Mr. Vale, once, and Sir Giles, of course. The eyes slid, just briefly, toward the mantel, where Sir Giles had resumed his stillness. There was history in that glance. Poirot filed it neatly. Next came the woman the servants called her ladyship's little shadow, though she was not little and not a shadow. Honorine Harrow, Sir Giles's sister-in-law, a woman of practical beauty and a temper like a honed blade. I manage certain household matters, she said. Charlotte found that tiresome and useful by turns. At 11:30, I was in the East Hall overseeing the— She paused delicately, overseeing that the staff did not unmask, as it were, at the wrong moment. And your mask, madame? Poirot's eyes twinkled. A cat. The children found it delightful. It would, Poirot murmured, be inappropriate to pursue the metaphor. There were others. A young curate with a face too earnest to lie well, two married couples whose smiles had the brittle quality of glassware, the butler, Kersey, grave as an undertaker, Foster, the footman who had found Lady Charlotte, and Mrs. Pettigrew, the housekeeper, affronted by tragedy on aesthetic grounds. They placed themselves upon the chessboard, squares of class and habit dictating their positions. And now, Poirot said, when the enumeration was complete, we come to the person who is not here, the guest in the silver half-mask. A tremor moved through them, relief and fear making a composite expression. Miss Lascelles spoke first. No such mask was assigned, Monsieur Poirot. I oversaw the distribution personally. Lady Charlotte herself had a golden mask, as you know. The others were black, white, a harlequin, a columbine, oh, and a fox. And a Mercury? Poirot's voice was gentle. She blinked. No. Then the silver was an addition, Inspector Winter growled. An intruder. Or, Poirot said, an improvisation. He looked to the console near the door, where, on a silver tray, last night's collection of masks lay like a shed menagerie. Among them, neat as a coin, the silver half-mask which no one claimed. He walked to it, looked down, and his head tilted, bird-like. "Monsieur Kersey," he said, without turning, "is it the custom in this house to polish silver with a proprietary cream?" "Yes, sir," the butler replied, attentive. "We use Harman's paste for the plate." Poirot's finger hovered a breath above the mask, tracing, not touching. "And is it also the custom to polish the backs of masks?" Kersey hesitated. "We would not normally, sir." "Just so." Poirot returned to his chair with the satisfaction of a man who has added 2 and 2, and written, not 4, but a little question mark beside it. "Last night," he continued, "Lady Charlotte was seen speaking in the library to the silver-masked guest. Who saw this?" Frederica Lyon lifted her gloved hand. "I did. I was crossing the hall and glanced in. He was tall. His voice, well, he was saying something about midnight. Something like, 'You will keep your promise, then?' Charlotte laughed and said, 'At midnight, everything is permitted.' It sounded like her." Frederica's mouth curved, as if remembering a pleasant cruelty. "Did she appear alarmed?" "Amused," Frederica said, then annoyed when a servant interrupted. "Foster," Miss Lascelles said quickly. "He brought a message." She caught, herself, the fortress door clanging shut. Poirot turned a little. "A message, mademoiselle? From whom?" "I do not know," she said. "It was delivered earlier by a boy from the village. I did not see the writing." "A letter?" Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "And upon the desk this morning a blotter that shows—" "What?" "We shall see. Mademoiselle, we will examine together the correspondence of last night. It is perhaps the only guest who does not wear a mask." Inspector Winter shifted. "We'll take the letter into custody." "But of course," Poirot said affably. "Only permit me to look first. I am old-fashioned. I like to meet my criminals socially before I meet them officially." He rose again, but did not at once leave. Instead, he let the silence gather its own courage. In silence, the guilty often supply you with what you have not asked. It was Jasper Vale who broke first, because men who laugh at propriety are often afraid of quiet. "Look here," he said amiably. "Why are we so certain this silver fellow isn't one of us? Couldn't any of us have, what's the word, exchanged masks? A little prank, a little spice?" Miss Lascelles answered too sharply. "The masks were affixed to cards bearing names. They were given out at 9. They were checked again at 10. "By whom?" Poirot asked. "By me," she said, and then, unable to resist it, "and by Lady Charlotte. She liked to count her toys." Poirot's eyes softened for a moment with something like pity. "Yes," he said, "and last night one of the toys was sharp." He dismissed them for the present, asking that no one leave the public rooms. He visited the morning room once more with Miss Lascelles in train, and there, with Inspector Winter at his shoulder, he examined the blotter. He did not need his lens. The impression was clear in its critical detail and obscure in its reassurance. There were the words 12, unmask, and above them the broken beginning of a name that could have been nothing or anything. Mur. He said nothing. He noted the absence among the scattered stationery of one small envelope, for the tray held 4, and the drawer bore impressions for 5. He noted the faintest scratch upon the window's outside sill, too low for a man's shoe and too sharp for accident. He noted, above all he noted, the loveliness with which the room had been tidied by someone who did not quite understand how to tidy, for grief and guilt have different ways of straightening a scene. When he left at last, it was with the air of a man who had arranged his ornaments just so. He asked to see the servants' list for the evening. He asked to know which guests had been late, and which had asked to retire early, and which had required hot water for baths at improper hours. He asked for the kitchen scullion, who had admired the masks when they were delivered from the costumers, and who, in admiring, had surely touched. And when Honorine Harrow came to him after, tart but with something like an appeal folded into the tartness, and said, "Monsieur Poirot, this house cannot bear scandal," he looked at her with a kind sadness and replied, "Madame, one does not avoid scandal by closing the shutters. One avoids it by opening the window and allowing in the truth." In the long gallery, as he passed, Jasper Vale paused before a family portrait of a young Lady Charlotte caught at 20, when even her cruelty had been charming. "At midnight," he murmured, and glanced sidelong at his reflection in the glass, as if wondering whether the face there belonged to him. On the console at the end of the hall, the silver half-mask lay where it had been placed, reflecting the grey afternoon, impersonal, available, a thing that made of any face the same blank promise. Poirot did not look at it as he went by. He had already seen what he needed, not the mask, but the carefulness with which it had been left, centered, exact, a symmetry only a certain kind of person would bother to achieve in the dark after a death. By late afternoon the drizzle lifted. The lawns shone faintly. Somewhere a clock chimed the quarter, and the house, despite itself, breathed. Poirot, seated alone for 10 minutes with a cup of chocolate made to his specification, wrote on a small card 3 words, and then turned the card face down. He allowed himself one indulgence, a private smile that did not reach his eyes. He had seen, he thought, enough to know which piece on his board preferred to move diagonally, which refused to move at all, and which, had already made a daring leap, and hoped, foolishly, to land without leaving a footprint. He would presently ask them all to dance again, without music, and note who kept time to a melody no one else could hear. The 10 minutes of chocolate were not an indulgence so much as a ceremony of order. When he had finished, Poirot wiped the saucer with an immaculate handkerchief, set cup and spoon to rights, and rang for Kersey. The butler came with the noiseless step of a man who had known great houses in better moods. "Monsieur," Kersey inclined his head. "We will look now at the traffic of last night," Poirot said. "Not the dancing, no, the traffic of paper and parcels. The costumes, who delivered them, at what hour, and who unpacked." "The costumer's van arrived yesterday afternoon at 3:15, Kersey replied at once. "Hobson's of Southampton. 2 men carried in 3 trunks. Mrs. Pettigrew checked the inventory with Miss Lascelles. The scullery maid and Foster helped to lay things out in the west anteroom. And the masks? In a separate hat box, sir, each wrapped and labelled. Miss Lascelles sorted them herself. Bon, and letters, telegrams, messages by hand?" "There were several notes by hand, sir, in the late afternoon and evening. Invitations acknowledged, that sort of thing. One came after 10, delivered by the vicar's boy. Ah, Thomas. Foster took it to the library." "For Lady Charlotte?" "Yes, sir." Poirot's eyes turned a fraction, pleased. "You will be so kind as to ask Mademoiselle Lascelles, Mrs. Pettigrew, Foster, and the scullion to the small study, one by one. I wish to speak with them while the memory is still exact." Inspector Winter, arriving as Kersey withdrew, grunted approval laced with scepticism. "Paper and parcels," he said, "whereas I should like to speak to Mr. Vale again about his brandy and Mrs. Lyon about midnight promises." "They will keep," Poirot said. "Paper is like people, Inspector. The quality is shown by how it takes the impression. Miss Lascelles came first, the notebook already open, as if she could bear the situation only by making lists of it. Poirot motioned to a chair angled to catch the thin afternoon light. "Mademoiselle," he said, almost tenderly, "it fatigues one to be the brain of a household. Yet courage. We will be brief. Explain to me how the masks were dispensed." Her pen hovered, then fell obediently into motion. I arranged them in the west anteroom by the names on their cards. At 9 precisely, guests went in pairs to collect their masks. I checked them against my list. Lady Charlotte took her golden mask from my hand at 9:20, laughing that it pinched like youth. There were no silver masks on my list. None. "And, pardon, with whom did you speak when the vicar's boy delivered a note?" "I spoke to Foster, who brought it in. I suggested he take it to Lady Charlotte in the library. He did. She was with a gentleman in a silver mask at the time." Foster hesitated. When he returned, he said Lady Charlotte had asked him to tell Sir Giles that she would be in the morning room presently. "She asked that?" "So Foster told me. I did not see her then." Poirot let the tiniest beat pass. "Mademoiselle, you are devoted to Lady Charlotte. What was her habit when she was irritated?" Miss Lascelles blinked. She straightened things that were already straight. "Merci." He smiled. "That is all for now. Courage, mademoiselle. Fatigue is a poor witness." Mrs. Pettigrew followed, her bosom like a barricade, her mouth set for battle with the disarray of fate. "Sir." "Madame," Poirot inclined, "you checked the costumer's invoice." "I did. Hobson sent all as requested. Harlequin, Columbine, Cat, Fox, Pierrot, 2 Venetian dominoes, a golden nymph, no Mercury. How well you remember. I keep a copy." From some fastness in her skirt, she produced a folded carbon. Poirot accepted it, with the reverence he might have offered an old prayer book. "Who had access to the anteroom after the masks were laid out?" "Any guest could go in the first hour. There was quite a fuss about feathers coming loose. But I stood at the door with Honorine Harrow for much of the time. Later the door was left on the latch, and Foster kept an eye." "And this morning?" "I locked it myself last night when the ball ended. This morning, at 7, I unlocked it to air the room. Nothing had been disturbed that I could see, except—" She hesitated. "Except, madame?" "The silver paste. I keep the silver paste for the sideboards in a tray. One of the pots had been moved. I put it back." Poirot's head turned. "Moved? From where to where?" "From the lower shelf of the console to the top. The lid was a little askew, as though someone had taken a dab for a personal trinket. I scolded the scullery maid for polishing when she ought to be heating water. Yet the paste was on the console in the west anteroom." "No, the morning room, sir. We keep a small tin in there for the inkstand caps and the paper knife. Lady Charlotte was particular." "Particular," Poirot repeated softly, and in his mind placed a small tick beside a thought. "Thank you, Madame Pettigrew. You are a general. I salute you." Foster came with the air of a man who had been suddenly promoted beyond his capacity. "Sir," he said to both men, "I'm that sorry." "We do not require sorrow," Poirot said. "We require exactitude. You delivered the note to the library?" "Yes, sir, 10 minutes after the half-hour. Her ladyship was with a gentleman in a silver mask, standing by the fire. She took the note, looked at it, and laughed. 'Always so dramatic,' she said. Then she told me to say to Sir Giles she would be in the morning room in 5 minutes, and that the unmasking would be moved to a few minutes after 12. Then she waved me away. I did as I was told and went to find Sir Giles." "Did you look again into the library on your way back?" "No, sir. I went round by the cloakrooms. When I came back up the west corridor 5 minutes later, for I had remembered a tray to be fetched, the morning room door was on the latch and the lamp was lit. I looked in, and there," he swallowed, his breath catching. "She was sitting at the desk, like a lady writing a letter. I ran for Sir Giles. Did you touch anything?" "No, sir." He flushed. "Only the door." "And the note? What became of it?" "Her ladyship put it down on the desk." Poirot nodded him away kindly, and asked next for the scullion, a thin creature with eyes like the black beads in the curtain fringes, who stood as if expecting to be struck. "You admire the masks," Poirot said, almost conspiratorially. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "They're pretty." "And did you see a silver one last night?" She shook her head. "Only this morning, sir, on the tray in the hall, when Mrs. Pettigrew sent me to dust. It had a smudge on the inside, like cloud." "Like cloud," Poirot repeated, smiling with his eyes. "And, my child, tell me, did you see the lovely sandals with the wings?" Her face lit. "Mr. Vale's, sir. He had little wings, stitched to them, and a stick with snakes on, like in the pictures." "A caduceus," Poirot murmured. "Merci, mignonne. You have been very clever." He sent her away with a coin, which she took shyly, refusing to look full at him, as if goodness might be catching. When the door had closed, Inspector Winter said, "Well then, Vale again. Wings, a staff, a taste for the dramatic. If anyone improvised a Mercury, it's our painter." "Perhaps," Poirot allowed. "You see what you expect, mon ami. A man who plays at costume in one part will play at it in another. But do not run too fast. You will miss who is following." They went together to the west anteroom. The trunks stood open, their tissue papers drooping like deflated gaiety. Poirot examined the labels, the strings, the neatness with which Miss Lascelles had arranged everything. He knelt, with a little sound at the protest this made to his tailor, and studied the scuffs on the floorboards. "You see," he said, pointing, not to the centre where shoes had trod, but to the gap near the console, where a trunk had been set down, and then, later, moved again. A thing taken out not at first, but after. And here, on the console, look, the ring where a small tin sat. He angled his head to catch the light. A faint oval of cleaner wood marked the place. "The silver paste," Winter said. "But what does that tell us beyond neatness?" "That someone, late, with a conscience for order, opened the tin and put it back imperfectly," Poirot said. "Not a servant. They would either leave it exactly as before, or frankly out of place. Someone imitating good housekeeping, as a child imitates the writing of a parent." "Mrs. Lyon? Miss Lascelles?" "Miss Lascelles knows too well," Poirot said. "Mrs. Lyon perhaps knows not at all." They crossed then to the morning room, and Poirot, with Kersey's sanction, sat at the desk as Lady Charlotte had sat. He placed the blotter before him. He breathed very gently. "You will forgive theatricals," he said, almost apologetic. "I am an old actor. I put myself in the part." At the angle of his eye, the window latch gleamed dully, the gilt dust fine as pollen. He reached, not to the latch, but to the little glass vase. He brushed a forefinger against the waterline, and then, with swift curiosity, touched his finger to his tongue like a cat. He made a face. "Mon Dieu, Harmons indeed," he said softly. "Ammoniacal. Very little, but enough." Winter stared. "The perfume of bitter almonds, people are so certain. It is a noise that drowns other smells. Here there are 3 notes, almond, silver paste, and, what is that? Orange blossom. Which of our ladies wears it?" "Mrs. Lyon, I think," Winter said reluctantly. "And perhaps Miss Lascelles." "2 chords, then," Poirot replied. "We shall not yet force the ear." He turned the blotter, and with the gentlest of pencils, shaded across the reverse. In light strokes, the impressions sprang up like ghosts called at a séance. 12, unmask, no delay, myrrh, and a flourish that might have been a Y, an E, a C. He stopped at once, as if fearful of his own conjuring. "Enough," he whispered. "We do not make the picture too dark." He looked next along the base of the desk, where a woman's skirt would brush. A pale smear showed on the oak, barely there, yet there, like the shadow of a hand. He touched it, then held his fingers apart delicately. Gold powder, he said. From a mask, the golden nymph, Lady Charlotte's. She fussed, she straightened, she brushed herself. And the latch? He stood, pressed the latch down and up. It caught cleanly. Last night someone pushed it without the patience to make it click. He lowered his hand to the sill outside, leaned, and indicated the light scratch. This is not a man's shoe. It is not a lady's heel. It is a small hard thing, metal, set down and taken up. A staff's ferrule, perhaps. A little snake-headed stick. Veil, Winter said again. Poirot smiled without agreement. We will see Hobson's list of props, he said, and then we will invite Mr. Vale to show us his wings. They found Jasper Vale in the library, contemplating, with calculated insouciance, a painting of a Harrow ancestor whose lace collar had survived 3 revolutions. He turned, easy as quicksilver. Monsieur Poirot, have you come to commission your own portrait? I work rapidly when flattered. Alas, monsieur, my moustaches cannot be improved by paint, Poirot returned. You had last night a staff, I think, with serpents. Vale widened his eyes innocently. Merely a walking stick with an amusing head from a shop in Bond Street. I like to accessorize. And the wings? A cobbler's joke. He lifted a trouser hem. The little stitched-on wings were undeniably charming. Perhaps in bad taste. Lady Charlotte laughed. And your silver mask? What silver mask? His lightness had the faintest hitch. You did not then, in some playful moment, exchange your assigned mask for a silver one and go to the library? I was a fox, Vale said. I remained a fox. Ask anyone who danced with me. I trod on half the village as a fox. And your walking stick? I left it in the cloakroom, I think. I cannot say. One loses one's head and stick at a masquerade. Poirot bowed a little. One loses only what one does not value, he said. Tell me, monsieur, you admired a brandy in the library at the half-hour. Who poured it? I did. I am not so decadent as to require a servant for every glass. And did you observe anyone pass toward the west corridor? Vale pretended to think, then made a face. I'm a bad witness, I'm afraid. The storm had got into my head. I remember Miss Lyon crossing the hall, dramatic in black. I remember Miss Lascelles standing by the door, with a list as if she were field marshal to a regiment of butterflies. I remember the curate, poor lamb, twisting his mask string like a rosary. Beyond that, merci, Poirot said. You have given me a little theatre, and I like the theatre. When they had gone, Inspector Winter said under his breath, He is lying. Of course, Poirot said serenely. But about what? That is the question. A man like that lies for the sport and for the vanity. We must discover if there is also a necessity. They sent for Hobson's list. Miss Lascelles, prompt as conscience, produced not only the invoice, but the annotated copy. There were no props listed beyond a paper fan and 2 Venetian capes. No caduceus, no silver mask. Poirot studied the foot of the page. In Miss Lascelles' neat hand, a private note. L.D. Add, gold leaf, powder. L.D.? Winter asked. Lady, Miss Lascelles said quietly. She told me to remind her to send a note to Hobson's today. She wished to purchase more gilding powder for the mask. She complained last night that it shed. Then she handled the powder late. She did, Miss Lascelles said. She went into the morning room at 10:15 to mend a chip. Poirot's eyes rested on the assistant for a beat that was not quite scrutiny and not quite comfort. And mademoiselle, this note she was to send, did she perhaps draft it last night? I suppose she may have scribbled something. He tapped the card in his pocket, the one he had turned face down earlier. He did not yet take it out. It is curious, he said reflectively, how the word midnight excites the blood. It makes children of us. We think, after midnight, the slate is clean. But it is only the other side of the same slate, n'est-ce pas? Evening drew down without drama. The house adjusted itself to the unnatural quiet of detainment. Poirot walked the long corridor alone and noted again the neatness with which the silver mask had been placed, as if by someone who could not bear disorder even at a moment of panic. He told Kersey gently to have the lid of the silver paste tin kept as it had been found, askew. At 7 he asked that the small gramophone in the drawing-room be wound. The guests looked surprised, then uneasy, then relieved. Poirot stood beside the console, hands folded. "You will please humour an old man," he said. "We will reenact only one tiny fragment. At the stroke of 11:30, I will ask you to move as you moved. Do not invent. Do not improve. Walk the steps your feet remember. The little grey cells, they have their cousins in the little muscles. They too recall." Inspector Winter shot him a look, half admiration, half dread of farce. The clock chimed the half-hour. The room breathed. Miss Lascelles made, involuntarily, 3 steps to the doorway and turned to check a list that was not there. Frederica Lyon drifted toward the darkened orangery like a moth returning to a pane. The curate's hand twitched where the mask string had been. Jasper Vale leaned with practised nonchalance against the library threshold, as if the pose fit an old groove. Poirot watched none of them directly. He watched the reflection of their movements in the polished lid of the gramophone. In that small rectangle of black lacquer, reversals made certain vanities plain. When the minute had passed, he said, "Merci," and the room exhaled. "Do you have your man?" Winter asked under the cover of the needle's faint scratch. "I have," Poirot said softly. "A picture. Tomorrow I will ask for the final brushstroke. Tonight we allow the paint to set." He turned, and his eyes rested for a moment on the silver mask, serene and foolish on its tray. "One may hide behind anything," he murmured, "but one cannot disguise the way one puts it down." The house did not sleep easily that night. Even those who claimed to be indifferent to the investigation found their steps quieter, their conversations more private, their eyes turning with suspicion to the faces they had known for years. In the stillness after midnight, Poirot moved along the west corridor with the measured tread of a man counting his own thoughts. He paused before the morning room, not to enter, but to let his gaze settle on the latch. Someone had straightened it since the day's inquiries. It now lay flush, neat, as though correcting a detail would somehow correct the event. The small change told him more than any confession. A guilty conscience loves symmetry. By breakfast, the air had the fragile calm of porcelain before it is struck. Poirot appeared at table precisely at 9, immaculate as ever, his moustaches a triumph of geometry. He accepted coffee from Kersey and took a single croissant, breaking it with delicate precision before speaking. "Messieurs, mesdames," he began in a tone that suggested an announcement about the weather, "this morning I shall require the assistance of 2 of you, Miss Lascelles and Mr. Vale. The others will forgive that I do not yet explain why. I will, however, say this. The truth, she is now within our grasp." Mr. Vale smiled as if the notion of being singled out were a compliment. "Delighted, Poirot. Shall I bring my wings?" he asked, with that lightness which sought to make suspicion itself appear absurd. "Bring only your candour, monsieur," Poirot replied, and the faintest curve at the edge of his mouth hinted that he expected it to be the lighter of the 2. Miss Lascelles did not smile. Her pen lay untouched beside her plate. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a pause too long before she reached for her tea. After the meal, Poirot led them both to the west anteroom, with Inspector Winter trailing like an unwilling shadow. The trunks still gaped open, the costumes folded with Mrs. Pettigrew's iron discipline. Poirot gestured toward the table where the masks lay in a neat array. "You will observe, mademoiselle, that the golden mask is here, The fox, the cat, the harlequin, the columbine. But the silver half-mask, though present, has been, how to say, over-polished. The interior, she is cleaner than the exterior. This is not the work of accident. Someone removed from it a trace that was inconvenient. Vale lounged against the wall, his hands in his pockets. Surely, Poirot, you're not suggesting I took a tin of polish to a mask in the middle of a ball? I may be vain, but not deranged. Poirot ignored the protest. He turned to Miss Lascelles. When the masks were assigned, mademoiselle, you say there was no silver one. Yet I am certain you noticed it later, perhaps not immediately, but soon enough. Her lips compressed. I did, around 10, as the guests were moving between rooms. I saw it in the library, just for a moment. Lady Charlotte was laughing at something the man wearing it had said. And you told no one? I assumed it was a guest's private edition. Lady Charlotte enjoyed that sort of mischief. Poirot's eyes softened, but he did not relent. And after the note arrived, after Foster spoke with her, she left the library for the morning room. Between that moment and the time she was found, the man in the silver mask vanished. Tell me, mademoiselle, how many exits from the morning room? One, she said promptly. Unless... She stopped. Unless one is very quick, very confident, and uses the window, which last night was unlatched. Poirot's tone was mild, but the silence after it was not. Inspector Winter's gaze slid toward Vale. That would take nerve. And purpose, Poirot said. To arrive masked when no such mask was provided, to speak to Lady Charlotte of midnight promises, to be in possession of a note whose origin is still unclaimed, this is not the behaviour of chance. Vale's easy posture tightened just perceptibly. You think I wrote the note? I think, Poirot said slowly, that you did not. The style, the hand, it is too severe for you, but you may have delivered it, and in delivering, you may have heard what it contained. Miss Lascelles' pen clicked open, as if she might take down even her own interrogation. Poirot turned to her again. Mademoiselle, when you saw the silver mask, was the man taller or shorter than Sir Giles? Taller, she said without hesitation, and slimmer. And his manner? Confident, almost intimate. Vale laughed once without mirth. Sounds like half the room. Perhaps, Poirot agreed, but only one of the room took the trouble to return a mask to its place with perfect centering. Only one would see that as the final act in a performance. They left the anteroom and went to the morning room. Poirot walked to the desk, resting his fingertips lightly on its edge. Imagine, if you please, the scene. Lady Charlotte is here, reading the note, perhaps already annoyed by it. She adjusts the flowers. She closes the silver paste tin after some earlier repair to her mask. Someone comes, someone she knows, for she does not cry out. They speak of midnight. The latch is touched. Why? To suggest departure, or to admit another? Then, the smell of almonds. She slumps. The pen falls. The visitor, careful, sets the latch without clicking it, replaces the tin not quite properly, removes the mask to avoid its being seen on him later, wipes its inside with the paste, and leaves it neatly on the tray. He departs by the window, staff in hand. Does this not fit, Inspector? It fits Vale, Winter said bluntly. Perhaps, Poirot said again, but there is still the note. Without the note, she does not leave the library. Miss Lascelles' pen made a small blot on her page. Poirot's eyes flicked to it. Mademoiselle, may I see your notebook? She hesitated, then passed it over. He flipped a few pages, scanning her shorthand. You are precise, he said approvingly. This entry, 12 unmasked, no delay mer. You have copied it? Her cheeks coloured. Yes, from the blotter. I noticed it before you arrived. And you did not think it worth mentioning? I did not wish to... cause trouble. For whom? Poirot asked softly. She looked down. For Sir Giles. Winter's head came up. Sir Giles? Miss Lascelles shut her notebook with a snap. The hand on that blotter was his. I've seen it 100 times, signing checks. But I don't believe he killed her. Poirot regarded her for a long moment, then nodded as though a piece had indeed fallen into place. You see, Inspector, why patience is a virtue. We now know that the note, whatever its intent, was written here, in this house, in Sir Giles's hand. And yet Sir Giles himself did not deliver it. That duty fell to another. Vale's voice was low. You think I carried his message? I think, Poirot said, that you carried something. Perhaps willingly, perhaps not. And that is what we must discover. Because if Sir Giles wished Lady Charlotte in the morning room alone at 11:30, he either meant to meet her or meant another to do so. They returned to the hall, where Sir Giles stood by the fire, his gaze steady but guarded. Poirot approached with his small, precise steps. Monsieur, a word. Last night at 11:10, you sent a note to Lady Charlotte? Sir Giles's expression did not change. I did. It was a private matter. And you gave it to? To Vale, Sir Giles said without hesitation. He was nearest. I asked him to take it to her in the library. That is all. Poirot inclined his head. And you remained? Where? In the card-room with Lyon and the Weatherbys. Until Foster came to fetch me. Poirot turned slightly, his voice quiet. Monsieur Vale, did you deliver the note as given? Vale's jaw tightened. I delivered it. She read it. She said she would be in the morning room in 5 minutes. That's all I know. And then you? Went to the library brandy, Vale said, meeting Poirot's gaze squarely. Poirot did not press further. Instead, he stepped back, his eyes moving from one to the other, reading in the stillness between them the residue of a quarrel too well bred to show its edges. Messieurs, he said at last, I will require all of you this evening in the drawing-room. We will, as the English say, put our cards on the table. As the day wore on, Poirot occupied himself in small, unhurried circuits of the house. He asked Kersey for the servants' accounts of Sir Giles and Lady Charlotte's marriage. He stood for 5 minutes in the orangery, watching the shadows move against the glass. He examined, with a faint frown, the back stairs from the morning room to the terrace, and at 5:30 he requested from Mrs. Pettigrew the tray of silver cleaning tins. He weighed each one in his palm, sniffed the contents, and set aside the smallest tin, in which the paste bore the faintest trace of perfume. By dinner, the guests were pale with fatigue and curiosity. The silver mask still sat in the hall, untouched, and every eye lingered on it in passing. Poirot dined lightly, speaking little, and at 9, when the coffee was brought, he rose. If you please, mes amis, we will now adjourn to the drawing-room, the little grey cells. They have worked enough. Now it is time they speak. There was a stir, the scraping of chairs, the subtle rearranging of expressions. Poirot led the way, his small frame somehow commanding the entire procession. Behind him, in 2s and 3s, came those who had danced, lied, and watched each other beneath masks of silk and politeness. Tonight, one mask would be removed for good. The drawing-room had been arranged exactly as Poirot wished it. The lamps were turned low, casting a golden wash over the faces gathered there. The chairs were placed in a loose semicircle, leaving a clear space before the mantel where he now stood. The rain had returned, tapping at the windows like an impatient listener. He let the silence breathe, his small hands resting lightly on the back of an armchair, eyes travelling slowly from one guest to the next. Mes amis, he began, his voice carrying without effort, we have danced long enough in the shadows. Tonight we bring the light. Each of you knows some part of the truth, small perhaps, but enough that when we fit them together, we will see the whole. Let us start with what cannot be disputed. Lady Charlotte was lured to the morning room by a note. That note was written in Sir Giles's hand, delivered by Mr. Vale, and read in the presence of a man wearing a silver mask that no one was assigned. Yes? There was a murmur of assent, reluctant but unanimous. Sir Giles sat upright, his face set in the way of a man enduring cross-examination. Vale, in contrast, lounged with his habitual ease, though Poirot noticed the restless flick of his fingers against his trouser seam. "It is important," Poirot continued, "to understand what the note promised, or threatened. I have no need to know its exact words. The effect was enough." Lady Charlotte left the library almost at once. She was not alarmed, only sharpened, as when she prepared to win an argument. She entered the morning room. The latch was touched but not secured. The silver-masked visitor followed or was already within, and by the time Foster returned 5 minutes later, she was dead. There is, you see, a very small window in which the deed could be done. Miss Lascelles' pen hovered over her notebook, as if she could not help herself. "Then it must have been the man in the mask," she said, almost with relief. "Exactement," Poirot agreed. "But here is the little difficulty. Who was the man in the mask?" He let the question rest in the room, felt it press against them. "Mr. Vale, you say you did not wear it. Yet you had the means. Your own costume was elaborate enough to pass unremarked. You possessed a staff with a ferrule that could have made the mark on the sill, and you were in possession of the note. The temptation, she is strong to point to you." "I'm flattered," Vale said lightly, though his colour had risen. "But flattery doesn't hang a man." "No," Poirot said, "but opportunity might. And you had it. Yet," he raised a finger, "you also had something the murderer would not have risked: visibility. You were seen by several guests at the time, and the risk of recognition through the mask was too great. Non, the silver mask was not your creation, monsieur. It was borrowed. And here we must look to the one person who had both reason to enter the morning room before the crime and knowledge of the household habits: Mademoiselle Lascelles." Her pen dropped to the carpet with a soft click. "Me? You knew the morning room was unlatched. You were accustomed to polishing small silver items for Lady Charlotte. You saw the mask in the library and knew it did not belong. And, mademoiselle, you had another motive: loyalty to Sir Giles. You knew of his quarrels with Lady Charlotte, of the financial strain, perhaps of the very threat contained in that note. You feared scandal, feared ruin, and so you rearranged. You may have believed you were protecting him." She sat rigid, her breath shallow. "If you mean I killed her, you're wrong. I would never—" Poirot held up his hand. "Calm yourself. I do not say you killed her. I say you sought to tidy the scene after. The silver paste, the scented mask. These are the gestures of someone whose instinct is to straighten what is crooked. But the killing? None. That, I think, was done by someone who knew Lady Charlotte would meet them at once if they came masked, someone she would treat as part of her own game, a man she trusted enough to admit without alarm." He turned, letting his gaze settle on Sir Giles. "You, monsieur?" A small sound escaped Frederica Lyon, a sharp intake of breath quickly disguised as a cough. Sir Giles did not move. "This is absurd," he said evenly. "Absurd? Perhaps. But then, life is absurd. You wrote the note. You arranged to meet her under the pretext of her own amusement, the masks. But why the silver mask? Because it would conceal you from any servant, and because it carried no association in her mind, no guest to attach it to. You could be anyone, and in that freedom you could act. You brought with you a small vial, perhaps in a glove, perhaps in the staff you borrowed from Vale earlier in the evening when he left it in the cloakroom. The poison, prussic acid, acts swiftly. A faint smell of almonds, masked in part by the silver paste. She was dead before the clock struck the 3/4 hour. And my motive? Sir Giles' voice was still measured, but the knuckles of his clasped hands were white. You feared divorce, Poirot said simply. The settlement would have been ruinous. Lady Charlotte's fortune was her own. Harrow Court, too. You would be left with nothing. The masked ball gave you the opportunity to approach her unseen, to vanish without a trail. The latch left unclicked was to suggest an intruder. The mask returned to the tray was a neat misdirection, and you relied upon the confusion of the guests, the lack of a clear description. Sir Giles's eyes narrowed. And yet you have no proof, only a little dust on a latch and a servant's memory. Non, Poirot said, and now there was steel in his voice. I have more. The perfume in the silver paste was Lady Charlotte's. The trace of it in the tin tells me the mask was wiped here, in this room, after her death. On the inner edge of that mask is the faintest imprint of a moustache. Yours, monsieur, though you keep it neatly trimmed. And, most damning, there is the ferrule mark on the sill. This morning, your study was found with a certain walking stick propped in the corner, the very one Vale thought lost. A thoughtful borrower would have returned it, oui? Vale's brows lifted. Well, that explains that. Sir Giles's stillness broke. If I wanted her dead, I could have chosen a dozen ways, a dozen times. Why now? Why here? Poirot spread his hands. Because now she had discovered something. The note you wrote, unmask, no delay, was not a flourish for the party. It was your answer to her threat to expose your dealings. You hoped to persuade her, perhaps to frighten her, but in the heat of the quarrel the poison was used. I think you had it with you for days, a small insurance. That night it became your solution. The room was very quiet. The rain's tapping seemed louder, a metronome marking the seconds. Frederica's eyes were on Sir Giles, unblinking. Miss Lascelles stared at the carpet, her hands tight on her knees. Vale leaned back, his earlier amusement gone. Inspector Winter moved forward. Sir Giles Harrow, I must— But Poirot raised a hand. One moment, if you please. Monsieur Harrow, you may deny the act, but you cannot deny that you wrote the note, that you donned a mask never issued, that you were unaccounted for in those minutes. And the law, she is very attentive to such facts. Sir Giles's composure wavered, just enough to reveal the effort it cost him. You are wrong, he said at last, but without conviction. Poirot gave a small bow, the performance complete. Perhaps the court will decide, but in my little court the verdict is clear. Winter stepped in, the formal words of arrest following like the closing of a heavy door. Sir Giles rose, straightened his jacket, and allowed himself to be led away, his dignity intact, if not his freedom. When the door closed, there was a collective exhalation. Vale ran a hand through his hair. Well, Poirot, I'd say you've earned your chocolate tonight. Miss Lascelles looked up, her face pale. If I had spoken sooner, it would have changed nothing, Poirot said gently. The truth, she will always find her way, like the river to the sea. He glanced toward the silver mask, still lying on its tray, its expression eternally blank. And a mask, however beautiful, cannot hide the shape beneath forever. Outside, the rain eased, and the first break of moonlight touched the wet gravel of the drive. Poirot gathered his hat, adjusted the line of his coat, and as he stepped into the hall, he murmured to Winter, It is curious, mon ami. People think the mask conceals, but it also reveals. One sees more truly when the face is not distracted by itself. And with that, he departed Harrow Court, leaving its silence to rearrange itself in the absence of the truth's weight. The rain had stopped by the time Poirot left Harrow Court, though the air still clung damply to the skin. The lamps along the avenue of beeches had been lit, their glow drawing pale paths across the gravel. His hired motor, waited at the foot of the steps, but he did not enter it at once. Instead, he stood very still, looking back at the great house, its windows glowing in uneven patterns, some dark, some bright, as if the building itself had moods. He knew from experience that even when the culprit was removed, a house like Harrow Court did not quickly return to tranquility. It absorbed guilt like stone absorbs cold, releasing it only over years. He turned the matter over in his mind as he finally stepped into the car. Sir Giles had been taken into custody, but certain notes did not resolve into a harmonious chord. The silver mask, the precise centering of it, the perfume in the silver paste tin. These details sat in his thoughts not as contradictions, but as unfinished embroidery, threads left hanging. The murderer's identity, yes, but the full story of the murder? That, Poirot knew, was not yet entirely told. Inspector Winter had sensed it too. As the car pulled away, Poirot recalled the man's look, half satisfaction, half the faint suspicion that the case had tied itself a little too neatly. It was not unusual for an arrest to leave shadows behind. Poirot, however, disliked shadows. They were untidy. The next morning found him back at Harrow Court, the excuse being a final review of certain papers for the court. In truth, he wished to walk the scene once more, without the charged atmosphere of accusation hanging over every gesture. The household, subdued and exhausted, received him without protest. The guests were dispersing. Vale had already left before breakfast, and Frederica Lyon was said to be resting, though Poirot suspected she was simply avoiding any further conversation about the events. Miss Lascelles, pale and tight-lipped, busied herself with the sorting of correspondence that had piled up over the last 2 days. He began in the morning room. The latch, now firmly set, was almost too correct, as if overcompensating for its earlier neglect. The silver mask still lay on the tray in the hall, untouched. Poirot stepped closer, bending to study the inside again. There, faint but visible in the right light, was the suggestion of a thumbprint. Not clear enough for police purposes, but the shape was distinctive, the pad wide and slightly flattened, as though the thumb had been injured at some earlier time. He recalled suddenly the hand of Mrs. Pettigrew, the housekeeper, who had once mentioned in passing that she had never quite got the use back, after an accident with a mangle in her youth. The idea was faint, but it settled in his mind with the quiet click of a puzzle piece. He retraced his steps to the west anteroom and examined the console where the silver paste tins were kept. Mrs. Pettigrew had moved the tin back to its place after the murder. She had been the one to correct the arrangement. It was her nature, yes, but it also meant she had been in the morning room after Lady Charlotte's death, before the police had truly taken possession of it. A natural role for a housekeeper, yet it offered opportunity for the careful removal of a trace that might incriminate someone else, or herself. He found her in the still room, measuring dried lavender into muslin pouches. She looked up, her manner deferential, but with a trace of defensiveness. "Monsieur Poirot, I thought all was settled." "In part, madame," he said pleasantly. "But you have managed a household for many years, n'est-ce pas? You know its rhythms. Tell me, on the night of the ball, did you notice anything unusual before the discovery?" She paused. "Only that the servants were more restless than usual. Such events unsettle them. And yourself? You entered the morning room?" Her eyes flickered. "Briefly, to see if her ladyship required anything." "And did she?" "She was occupied. I withdrew." Poirot inclined his head, as though satisfied, but made a mental note of the slight tremor in her hands. Not fear exactly, but the vibration of someone holding back a truth. As he left her, he encountered Miss Lascelles in the corridor, a letter in hand. She hesitated, then passed it to him. "This came for you, Monsieur Poirot. It was delivered by hand." The envelope was plain, the handwriting careful, but without flourish. Inside was a single slip of paper, bearing only 2 lines. "You have the wrong man. The mask was mine. I can prove it." There was no signature, but the faint scent of orange blossom clung to the page. Frederica Lyon. He looked at Miss Lascelles, who had clearly not read the contents, and said only, "Merci, mademoiselle. I will reply." He found Frederica in the orangery, as he had half expected. She was in black still, though the severity of it seemed more costume than mourning. She did not rise when he entered. "You received my note," she said. "I thought it best to put it plainly." "Plainly, perhaps, but now you will explain." He took a chair opposite her, folding his hands. She met his gaze without flinching. "I wore the silver mask. Not for the entire evening, only briefly. Vale had left it on a table in the library, claiming it was a prop he'd brought along. I put it on as a lark, to surprise Charlotte. She enjoyed games like that. I went to the morning room after she left the library, thinking to tease her about her midnight promises. She laughed. Then, her voice faltered, then someone else came in, Sir Giles. And you? I stepped back into the alcove by the window. I heard their voices, low at first, then sharper. I caught only fragments, something about money, about keeping things quiet. Then Charlotte's tone changed. She said, "At midnight, I will tell them all." There was a pause, then a sound, a gasp, and she was still. I didn't wait. I slipped out the window. It was raining. I went round to the orangery and removed the mask, leaving it on the tray in the hall later. Poirot regarded her in silence for a moment. "You risk much in telling me this, Madame Lyon." "I risk more if an innocent man hangs," she replied evenly. "I believe Giles meant to frighten her, not kill her. But fright can tip into something else. And you said nothing before?" She gave a small, bitter smile. "Would anyone have believed me? Charlotte and I had history. People would have thought I was settling a score." Poirot leaned back. The picture altered subtly but significantly. Frederica's presence explained the open latch, the ferrule mark if she had carried the mask and stumbled slightly on the sill, the centering of the mask if she had placed it down herself. It did not, however, absolve Sir Giles. It merely complicated the arrangement of events. When he left her, Poirot went directly to Inspector Winter, who was still at Harrow Court, completing his paperwork. He laid out the new account in precise detail. Winter listened without interruption, then sighed. "So, your neat solution has frayed a bit." "It has," Poirot agreed cheerfully. "But the tapestry, she will be mended. We must speak again to Sir Giles, and to Vale. This mask, she has been too much in his possession for him to be innocent of its journey." Winter arranged for both to be brought back the next morning. Poirot returned to his lodgings in the village, his mind working in measured circles. 2 people in the morning room, one hidden, one speaking, the note written by Giles, the mask in Vale's hands, the final act resulting in Charlotte's death. Somewhere in this tangle lay the truth, and Poirot had begun to suspect that the murderer had relied less on cunning than on the chaos of too many actors on the same small stage. That night, as the wind rose again, he wrote a list of every movement between 11 and 11:30, placing each player on his imaginary board. The sequence, when reduced to bare facts, was tight enough that a single misremembered minute could alter the whole outcome. He tapped his pen against the final item, silver mask placed on tray. There lay the heart of it, not who had worn it, but who had wished it to be seen and assumed that no one would ask too closely when or why. By the time he set down his pen, Poirot's expression was one of quiet satisfaction. The little grey cells had arranged the picture. Tomorrow he would invite them all to view it, and they would see that in the end the mask had hidden nothing at all. The next morning was raw and grey. the kind of Hampshire morning where the mist does not lift so much as loosen its grip on the fields. Harrow Court seemed less imperious in this light, its stone dulled, the gravel drive streaked with wet. Poirot arrived just after 9, his boots spotless despite the weather, his manner brisk with the quiet certainty of a man whose thoughts had resolved themselves in the night. Inspector Winter was already there, seated in the small study with his notes spread across the desk. 2 chairs had been placed opposite him, one for Sir Giles, one for Jasper Vale, and Frederica Lyon, though not summoned, had appeared in the doorway as if drawn by some private compulsion. Miss Lascelles stood by the window, her notebook clasped in both hands, the familiar shield. Poirot greeted them all with his usual courtesy, before taking his place at the mantel, his back to the fire. "We have, mes amis, a few final steps to take. The truth, she is like a souffle, delicate, and she must be handled gently until the moment she is served. Now we serve it." He turned first to Sir Giles. "You wrote the note to Lady Charlotte. This you admit. You entrusted it to Mr. Vale, and yet you tell me you remained in the card-room until Foster fetched you. But, monsieur, there is a space in your account, a gap of minutes, that you have not explained." Sir Giles's jaw tightened. "I stepped out to speak to a guest. That is all." "A guest," Poirot repeated, "who does not recall speaking with you." His eyes shifted to Vale. "Monsieur Vale, you left your walking stick in the cloakroom. You say you did not wear the silver mask. Yet the mask, when examined, bore the faint mark of your caduceus's ferule on the sill of the morning-room window. How is this possible if you were not there?" Vale's hand went to his hair, smoothing it back with unnecessary precision. "Because someone else used it. I saw Giles pick it up earlier in the evening. He was admiring the work on the handle. I assumed he meant to tease me about the wings." Poirot's moustaches twitched. "And you said nothing when the stick reappeared in his study the next morning?" "I thought he'd returned it himself." Vale's voice was light, but the muscles along his jaw were taut. Frederica took a step forward from the doorway. "And you thought nothing of the silver mask you left in the library? The one I wore for those few minutes before?" She stopped herself, but the silence completed her meaning. Poirot's gaze rested on her. "Ah, Madame Lyon, we come to you. You wore the mask, you entered the morning-room, you hid when Sir Giles came in. This is your account, and I believe it. But the mask, its journey is important. You say you took it off and placed it on the tray in the hall after you left the orangery. Yet the mask on the tray was clean, too clean, inside, and scented faintly of silver polish." "Did you polish it, madame?" She frowned. "Of course not. Why would I?" "Just so," Poirot said softly. "It was not you. The mask was moved again after you placed it down. It was wiped clean, the paste applied, and then it was centered with a precision that is almost a signature." He turned to Miss Lascelles. "Mademoiselle, I think you recognize the hand that straightens what is crooked." Her fingers tightened on the notebook. "I tidied it, yes. I thought it had been dropped carelessly. I didn't know—" "You tidied it after Lady Charlotte was found, before the police took full charge," Poirot said. "You believed you were removing a servant's carelessness, but you also removed a trace, something inside the mask that might have told us exactly who had worn it last." Inspector Winter leaned forward. "So we're back to Giles." "Patience, mon ami," Poirot murmured. "We must understand the sequence. Sir Giles sends the note by Vale. Vale leaves his stick in the cloakroom. Sir Giles takes it. Frederica, wearing the silver mask, goes to the morning-room. Sir Giles enters. She hides in the alcove. Words are exchanged. Tempers rise. At some moment, Sir Giles uses the poison, intended perhaps as a threat, administered perhaps in haste, and Lady Charlotte dies. Frederica slips out through the window, hurries to the orangery, removes the mask, later, places it on the tray. The mask is seen by Miss Lascelles, who tidies it with the silver paste. unintentionally erasing what it carried, and the stick, returned to the study before morning, remains the only physical link. Sir Giles exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on Poirot. "You make it sound very neat." "It is neat," Poirot said, "but one thing remains. The poison. Where did it come from?" Here he let the silence stretch, watching the flickers of thought on each face. It was not brought in from outside that night. Number It was in the house already, and there is only one person who could have kept such a thing without comment, Dr. Pritchard, who attended Lady Charlotte. A small vial, part of his medical supplies. Sir Giles had access, an old friend, often in his surgery. Is it not so? Sir Giles did not answer, but his gaze dropped, and that was enough. Poirot inclined his head. "So, you see, the chain is complete. Each of you played a part. Vale, in providing the mask and the stick. Frederica, in being the unexpected witness. Miss Lascelles, in the well-meaning but destructive tidying. And Sir Giles, in the act itself. But only one intended the death." Winter rose, the authority in his movements this time unclouded by doubt. "Sir Giles Harrow, you'll come with me again. And I think this time you won't be leaving so soon." Sir Giles stood slowly, his dignity still intact, though his colour had drained. "You've been thorough, Poirot." Poirot spread his hands. "It is my business, monsieur, to be thorough, and to remember that even the smallest act, a mask placed just so, can speak louder than words." When the door closed behind them, Frederica let out a breath she had been holding. Vale moved to the window, staring out into the pale mist, as though it might offer him an escape from the role he had played. Miss Lascelles, very still, shut her notebook and slid it into her pocket. Poirot looked at each of them in turn. "You see, my friends, the truth is rarely the work of one alone. Even in murder, there is often a chorus, though only one sings the final note, and here at Harrow Court, the music will not soon be forgotten." He left them then, the echo of his footsteps on the marble floor as precise as the order he carried in his mind. The case closed not with triumph, but with the calm satisfaction of symmetry restored. The mist lingered on the fields as Poirot made his way down the drive, his figure small and upright against the greyness. The car door was opened for him, but he paused with one hand on the frame, casting a last glance back toward Harrow Court. He did not look at the house itself, but at the windows of the morning-room, their panes dulled by moisture. He had stood there the night before the ball, listening to Lady Charlotte discuss the precise order of the evening. She had spoken of the drama of concealment, with that gleam in her eye which suggested that the real pleasure lay in controlling the reveal. Now the game had ended, but not as she had intended. The motor jolted forward, and the house slipped from view behind the beeches. Poirot leaned back, his mind not on the scenery, but on the echoes that always follow the closing of such a case. The law would have its process, the newspapers would circle like carrion birds, and within weeks the details of Harrow Court's tragedy would be recited in drawing-rooms far from Hampshire. Yet he thought, not for the first time, that the human debris left behind was the part no court could tidy. Vale would replay his decision to hand over the mask. Miss Lascelles would never again enter a room without wondering if her instinct to straighten might one day erase something vital, and Frederica Lyon, Frederica, would have to live with the knowledge that in hiding from danger she had witnessed it. They had all been willing to speak once Sir Giles's composure cracked, but Poirot had learned long ago that people speak not when they are ready, but when they think the story will no longer turn against them. It was as much a performance as the masquerade itself, the shifting of masks to match the moment. In the village, Poirot asked the driver to stop at the post office. Inside, the smell of ink and damp envelopes greeted him like an old acquaintance. He sent a short wire to Chief Inspector Japp in London, purely out of courtesy, for the case was in Winter's hands, and another to his tailor in Savile Row, whose work on a certain coat had been interrupted by this affair. As he signed his name, his eyes rested on a rack of local newspapers. The topmost bore a headline in large type: "Masked Ball Murder. Society Host Charged." Beneath, the words were an untidy version of events, heavy on innuendo, light on fact. He purchased a copy and read it over a modest luncheon in the village inn. The reporter, with that sly liberty the press allowed itself, hinted at jealousies among the guests and the sudden disappearance of a mysterious masked figure. Frederica's role was compressed into a single suggestive sentence. Vale was described as a gentleman artist of unconventional habits, which Poirot supposed might be both fair and unhelpful. Miss Lascelles was absent from the account entirely, her part erased as neatly as she herself would have erased any blemish from a tabletop. When the coffee arrived, he sipped it slowly, his mind circling the one fragment still unsettled. Sir Giles' insistence that he had not meant to kill his wife. Poirot did not believe him entirely, but neither did he dismiss the possibility that the act had been quicker than the thought behind it. Poison was rarely an improvisation, unless one already had it in hand. He thought again of the vial from Doctor, Pritchard's supplies, of the easy access a man like Sir Giles would have had in a house where comings and goings were not questioned. A little insurance, as Poirot had called it, the sort of thing one might carry without quite deciding what to do with it. By the time he returned to his lodgings, the mist had thinned into a pale, reluctant sunlight. He sat at the small desk and began to order his notes. His method, always, was to write the sequence of events twice, once as it had appeared to those involved, and once as it had truly occurred. In the first version, the night was a confusion of dancing, disguises, and the sudden interruption of death. In the second, it was a chain of deliberate actions, each small link connected, each movement leading inevitably to the moment at 11:30, when the balance tipped. He had just finished the second sequence when there was a knock at the door. The innkeeper's boy entered with a note on a silver salver, clearly proud of the formality. Poirot took it with a nod. The handwriting was Vale's, bold, a little theatrical. "Monsieur Poirot," it read, "I am leaving for Paris tomorrow. You may believe me or not, but I swear the mask was never meant for harm. If you are in Paris in the spring, I will paint you, no charge. My wings are better than you think." Poirot smiled faintly at that. Vanity was often the twin of guilt, but in Vale's case, it was the twin of a restless need to be seen. He doubted the man would remain in Paris long. Such spirits preferred to be always arriving somewhere. That evening, with his cases closed and his papers arranged, Poirot allowed himself a quiet dinner in the inn's private room. The fire was steady, the wine acceptable, the solitude welcome. Yet his thoughts drifted once more to Harrow Court. He imagined Miss Lascelles in her small office, perhaps already drafting the letter to Hobson's about the golden mask's gilt powder. Frederica standing in the orangery, her reflection faint in the glass. Mrs. Pettigrew moving through the rooms with her accustomed efficiency, as if by restoring the furniture to its proper places, she could restore the people as well. He knew, as he had known when he first stepped into the morning-room, that the scent of bitter almonds had not been the most dangerous thing in the air that night. It had been pride, wounded, guarded, and in Sir Giles's case, cornered. Pride could make murder seem not only necessary, but tidy. And tidiness, Poirot thought, was a far more dangerous motive than passion. Passion burned out quickly. Tidiness lingered, rearranging the scene until it suited its own idea of order. The clock on the mantel struck 9. Poirot rose, poured himself a final cup of chocolate from the pot the innkeeper had left, and stood by the window. The village street was empty. the lamps throwing small pools of light onto the cobbles. Somewhere, a shutter banged lightly in the wind. He felt the contentment that came when all the pieces had been laid in their proper places. And yet, as he turned back to the fire, he allowed himself the smallest of concessions. The awareness that in human affairs there was always another mask waiting to be lifted. The next morning he would take the train to London, the case of the masked guest at Harrow Court neatly folded away among the others. But tonight, in the quiet warmth of the room, he let his mind drift over the familiar truth that people, like puzzles, were often most revealing in the spaces they left empty, and that the neatest arrangement of facts could never quite conceal the shadows between them. The train to London the following morning was half empty, the sort of carriage Poirot preferred. No one to disturb his thoughts, and the steady rhythm of the wheels lending itself to contemplation. He had folded his notes neatly into his case, yet he did not read them. Instead, he looked out at the passing countryside, letting the green and grey blur together, while his mind traced again the line between what was proven and what was simply accepted. Sir Giles's arrest had satisfied the law, but Poirot had never mistaken legal conclusion for absolute truth. There was still the matter of timing, the dangerous minutes between the moment Frederica slipped into the alcove and when she fled through the window. She had said the quarrel escalated quickly, but quickly was a word without precision. In a quarrel, a single phrase could stretch a minute, and a silence could last much longer than the ticking of a clock would suggest. Somewhere in that small, elastic space, the decision to kill had been made, or perhaps the opportunity seized by someone who had not intended to act until then. When the train pulled into Waterloo, the city seemed its usual restless self, hansom cabs rattling alongside motor cars, the air full of voices and the faint metallic tang of industry. Poirot, who disliked haste in all its forms, moved through the crowd with his usual deliberation. He had no appointment until the afternoon, when Winter was to meet him at Scotland Yard to go over the final statement, but something tugged at his mind, a small itch that refused to be ignored. Instead of hailing a cab, he walked, his steps drawing him toward a particular address in Harley Street. Dr. Lionel Pritchard's brass plate was polished to the same severity as the man himself. The doctor received Poirot with the politeness due a celebrated detective, though his eyes suggested the visit was an inconvenience to his morning's schedule. "Doctor," Poirot began without preamble, "you kept certain poisons in your practice. Cyanide among them?" Pritchard's brow furrowed. "As any physician might, for legitimate medical use, though in very small quantities and under strict control." "And these quantities," Poirot said mildly, "would they be missed if removed in a dose suitable for, say, a glass of champagne?" The doctor stiffened. "I keep careful records, Monsieur Poirot. If you are implying—" Poirot lifted a placating hand. "I imply nothing. I merely seek to understand how Sir Giles could have obtained such a thing. You have known him for years. He could have visited your surgery, perhaps under the pretext of some minor ailment." Pritchard hesitated. "He came in a fortnight before the ball, said he'd been having trouble sleeping. I prescribed a mild sedative. He did not ask for anything stronger." "But you left him alone in the room at any time?" "I may have stepped out to fetch a file," the doctor admitted, "but I cannot believe he would." Poirot rose, bowing slightly. "It is not always what one believes, doctor, but what is possible that matters. Merci for your time." Back on the pavement, Poirot felt the faint tightening of the pattern in his mind. Access, opportunity, and motive, all in place. And yet, as he walked toward the yard, he thought again of Frederica's testimony, of the peculiar neatness with which the mask had been placed on the tray. If Sir Giles had acted in sudden temper, would he have had the presence to arrange it so? Or had someone else, perhaps even after the fact, added that touch to confuse the trail? Winter was waiting for him in an upstairs office, the papers already stacked. "We'll be wrapping this up by week's end," he said. "The evidence is solid. Jury won't take long." Poirot settled into the chair opposite. "Solid, yes. But tell me, mon ami, do you not feel there is a second hand in this affair? One that did not strike the blow, but moved certain pieces afterward?" Winter regarded him with the wary patience of a man who had heard Poirot's reservations before. "If you're talking about Miss Lascelles and the mask, she's admitted to tidying it. Unfortunate, yes, but hardly conspiracy." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Perhaps. But consider. She was in the corridor within moments of the body being found. She sees the mask, knows it does not belong, and moves it. Why? A true servant of order would have brought it to the police, not placed it back among the others. This, I think, was instinct, but an instinct not entirely innocent. She sought to preserve something. Whether for Sir Giles, for the house, or for herself, I do not yet say." Winter leaned back. "And you mean to keep worrying at this even after the case is closed?" Poirot smiled faintly. "The mind she does not close as neatly as a file." When he left the yard, it was with the sense that the last piece was close, though not yet in his grasp. He walked through the streets, thinking of the silver mask, Vale's possession, Frederica's wearing, Lascelles' tidying, 3 hands on one object in the space of perhaps 20 minutes. And in that same span, Lady Charlotte had died. The mask was less a disguise than a thread passed from one to the other, carrying with it the silent record of where it had been. That record had been wiped clean, not by accident, but by choice. Late that evening, back in his flat, Poirot laid the facts before him once more, but this time in the form of a chain. He wrote each event on a separate card, placing them in sequence on the desk. Mask delivered, mask worn, mask removed, mask replaced, mask tidied. Then, almost idly, he rearranged them, placing mask tidied before mask replaced. The picture that emerged was not of Lascelles correcting a careless placement, but of her taking the mask directly from Frederica and placing it herself, centered, polished, its trace gone. If that were true, then Lascelles had been in the orangery or the hall immediately after Frederica removed the mask, before it could be left anywhere else, which meant she had been much closer to the scene than she admitted, and at a time when the murderer could still have been present. Perhaps she had even seen more than she chose to tell. Poirot sat back, his eyes narrowing. The affair, it seemed, still had one unlifted mask, and he, Hercule Poirot, was not a man to leave a mask in place when it might yet conceal the final truth. Tomorrow, before the court could close its hand entirely around Sir Giles, he would return to Harrow Court once more. There, in the familiar corridors, among the echo of footsteps and the faint scent of silver polish, he would ask Miss Beatrice Lascelles the question she had been hoping he would not think to ask, at least not until it was too late. The following morning broke with a brittle clarity, the mist burned away by a pale sun that made the frost on the fields sparkle like powdered glass. Poirot arrived at Harrow Court once again, unannounced. The house was quieter now, emptied of guests, its great rooms echoing faintly with the absence of voices. Only the steady sounds of work, coal being shifted, water carried, gave it life. Mrs. Pettigrew met him in the hall with the composure of a woman determined to keep routine, though her eyes darted toward the silver mask still resting on its tray, as if to confirm it remained untouched. "I have come," Poirot said pleasantly, "for a small matter that will trouble no one. Miss Lascelles, is she within?" "She's in the small library, going through correspondence," Mrs. Pettigrew replied. "Shall I?" "Non, non, I will go to her." Poirot crossed the hall, the sound of his footsteps distinct against the marble. The small library was bright with winter light, and Miss Lascelles was at a writing desk, her back very straight, her pen moving quickly over a stack of letters. She looked up, startled, as he entered. "Monsieur Poirot, what brings you back? I thought that all was concluded." "So thought I. But the mind, she is like the stomach, mademoiselle. It is not wise to leave her half satisfied." He closed the door behind him and took the chair opposite her. "We will speak frankly, you and I." Her fingers tightened around the pen, but she said nothing. "On the night of the ball," Poirot began, "you have told me you saw the silver mask after the body was found, and disliking disorder, you placed it properly with the others. Yet I think that is not quite how it happened. You did not find it already lying there. You took it directly from Madame Lyon, and you placed it yourself." Her eyes flickered, but she did not deny it. "She came in from the terrace," she said at last, her voice low. "She was pale and she was holding the mask in both hands. She didn't look at me, just muttered something about not wanting to be seen with it. I took it from her. And you polished it. I wiped the inside. It was damp, and it smelled faintly. Odd. I didn't think—" She broke off, pressing her lips together. "You thought enough to remove what might have been evidence," Poirot said gently. "Why, mademoiselle? To protect Madame Lyon? Or someone else?" Her gaze shifted to the window. "You don't understand. Lady Charlotte was a difficult woman. She knew things about people, and she used them. Madame Lyon had reason to fear her. So did Sir Giles. I thought, if the mask was linked to Frederica, then suspicion would fall on her," Poirot finished, "and you could not bear that." "I couldn't bear another scandal for the house," she said sharply, then caught herself. "Sir Giles has been good to me. He gave me work when I needed it, trusted me. If the mask had been traced to Frederica, it would have been ruin for her, and for him." Poirot studied her for a long moment. "So you acted on impulse, to protect two people at once. But in doing so, you also protected the murderer." The silence that followed was long enough for the clock on the mantel to mark 3 distinct minutes. She looked down at her desk. "I didn't know who it was. I still don't. But I thought, better to keep the question open than to have the answer be the wrong one." "Ah," Poirot murmured, "but the wrong answer. She can live a long life in the shadows. I will tell you what I think, mademoiselle. You saw more than you admit. Perhaps not clearly, perhaps only shapes, a movement, but enough to know that Sir Giles was not alone in the morning room." Her head came up sharply, colour draining from her face. "You heard another voice," Poirot said, his tone almost conversational, "and you recognized it. The voice of a man who would have had no reason to be there, unless summoned, or unless he came to collect something. Perhaps Mr. Vale, come to retrieve his stick, or Dr. Pritchard, checking on his patient under the guise of a guest." She hesitated, then said, "It wasn't Vale. I can't be sure, but yes, it might have been Dr. Pritchard, low, deliberate, but I didn't see him." Poirot nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "That, mademoiselle, is enough. You have done what you can. Now I will do the rest." He rose, bowed slightly, and left her to her correspondence. Outside, in the crisp air, he stood for a moment at the foot of the steps, drawing the threads together. If Dr. Pritchard had been in the morning room, then the neat picture of Sir Giles as sole culprit shifted. The vial of poison might never have left the doctor's possession until that night. A second player, whether willing or not, had been in the room at the moment of death. That explained the timing, the precision, the lack of visible preparation. Sir Giles may have written the note and provided the opportunity, but the delivery of the fatal dose could have been another's hand entirely. Poirot returned to the village and sent a wire to Winter, asking him to bring Dr. Pritchard to Harrow Court that afternoon, under the pretext of clarifying a medical point for the inquest. The inspector, though sceptical, agreed. By 4 o'clock, they were seated once again in the morning room, the same space, the same desk, though the air was fresher now, the window open to let in the cold. Pritchard sat opposite Poirot, his manner impatient. "This had better be quick," he said. "It will be," Poirot replied. "You were in this room on the night of the ball, just before Lady Charlotte's death." "That's absurd," Pritchard said too quickly. "Mademoiselle Lascelles heard your voice," Poirot continued. "You came by the west corridor, carrying a glass. You set it on the desk beside her. She drank from it." Pritchard's hand twitched. "And if I did?" "She asked for a drink. I happened to be passing the bar. I thought nothing of it." "You thought nothing," Poirot repeated softly. "But someone else thought very much. Sir Giles saw you bring the drink. He knew you had in your possession the means to end her life. And whether you knew it or not, that glass carried the poison." The doctor's face had gone pale. "You're saying Giles put it there, before I took it?" Poirot spread his hands. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you placed it at his request, not knowing the contents. But either way, monsieur, the hand that delivered it was yours." Pritchard's protest faltered. Winter leaned forward. "Best to be honest, doctor." At last Pritchard spoke, the words coming like stones dragged from the mud. "She complained of a headache, asked for something to clear her head. I fetched a drink from the sideboard. Giles was there. He dropped something in. I thought it was a sedative. I didn't question him." Poirot inclined his head, his eyes holding the doctor's. "You see, Inspector, the chain is now complete. Sir Giles planned, but the opportunity was taken through another's unsuspecting hand. The mask, the latch, the movements afterward, all were meant to focus suspicion elsewhere. But it is in the voice heard by one careful woman that the truth was preserved." Winter gave a slow nod. "This changes the charge." "Indeed," Poirot said. "But the guilt, she is not diminished, merely shared." As Pritchard was led away, Poirot stood by the window, looking out over the darkening lawns. The cold air stirred the curtains, carrying with it the faintest trace of something metallic and sharp. He let it pass, knowing that the house would keep its scent for a long time, just as it would keep the memory of the night when a masked game became a true unmasking. And in the end, it was not the grand clues or the bold gestures that undid the murder, but the smallest thing, a voice overheard and remembered. Poirot closed the window, satisfied at last, and with the precision of a man completing a perfectly aligned tableau, placed the silver mask back on the tray where it belonged. The next day dawned brighter, the frost melting in small rivulets that traced the gravel of Harrow Court's drive. The great house seemed quieter still, the kind of hush that follows a storm, not from relief, but from the exhaustion of those who have weathered it. Poirot arrived once more, his small frame immaculate against the pale light, to find Inspector Winter waiting in the hall with an expression of completion about him. The final statements had been taken. "Doctor." Pritchard's reluctant confession was now neatly stitched into Sir Giles's already damning tapestry of guilt. They stood together in the morning room, the desk cleared at last of its clutter. The silver mask had been removed, no longer a silent witness to deceit, but sealed away with the rest of the exhibits. The air seemed lighter, though the faintest trace of bitter almond still clung in the grain of the wood, a ghost of the crime, stubborn as memory. "You've got your symmetry now," Winter said, watching Poirot adjust a paperweight by a fraction. "Oui, mon ami," Poirot replied, "and you see, it is not a question of one hand alone. Murder, she is often a duet, one voice carrying the melody, the other supplying the harmony, whether by choice or by ignorance. Sir Giles played his part with calculation, but without the good doctor, the music would have faltered." Winter glanced at him. "And the others?" "Vale, Miss Lascelles, Madame Lyon, they'll live with their own parts in it?" Poirot's moustaches twitched. Ah, but that is the true sentence, n'est-ce pas? The law cannot punish a moment of cowardice, or the tidying of a thing that ought to be left untidy, or the desire to step away unseen. But each will remember the mask in their own way. Vale will think of it as a prop that escaped his control, Madame Lyon as the shield behind which she hid, and Mademoiselle Lascelles, she will always hear the echo of a voice she should have named sooner. They walked out into the hall, where Mrs. Pettigrew was directing the final removal of the police cordons with the brisk authority of someone reclaiming her domain. She gave a short nod to Poirot, an acknowledgment, not of thanks, but of recognition that the house was hers to order once again. On the steps, Poirot paused. The beeches along the avenue stood black against the pale sky, their bare branches knitting together overhead. He thought of the night, of the ball, the storm, the press of masks in the golden light, and the moment when the game had turned. "It is curious," he said to Winter, "how people believe a mask will conceal their true nature. But it is in the way they wear it, in the way they put it down, that the truth escapes." Winter smiled faintly. "You'll make a philosopher of me yet, Poirot." Poirot tipped his hat. "Better a philosopher than a cynic, mon ami. A cynic believes all men guilty. A philosopher knows they are merely human." As they parted, the last of the frost melted from the gravel, and Harrow Court stood once more in its stately silence. Inside, the rooms would be set in order, the windows polished, the traces of the ball erased. But somewhere, in the quiet corners of memory, the silver mask would remain, its expression blank, its gaze unblinking, holding in its curve the entire story of pride, secrecy, and the fatal game played on a winter's night. And Hercule Poirot, walking away with his steps measured and his hat set at the precise angle, was content. The little grey cells had done their work, the balance was restored, and the masks, every one of them, had been lifted.